Back in high school, I was on the basketball team, not because I was particularly good at it, but more to have something to add to my college resume. One night, we were playing a game against a nearby school, though I can't recall the name of it now. It wasn't an important game, and the bleachers were sparsely populated. We were losing by about 22 to 13 when one of the kids on the opposing team started trash-talking me and a few of my teammates. His main target, though, was me. He kept making fun of my size and my hair, throwing jabs every time I missed a shot. It got to the point where I couldn't take it anymore. My frustration boiled over, and in a fit of anger, I shoved the kid as hard as I could. He flew backward, sliding off the court, and suddenly everything stopped. My teammates held back his, the refs blew their whistles, and I was ejected from the game. But I didn't care. It felt too good to feel bad about it. I stormed past my coach, ignoring the look of disappointment on his face, and headed straight for the locker room. When I reached the door, I found it locked for some reason. Not wanting to face my coach again and to ask him for the key, I decided to go outside and enter the locker room through the back entrance. That door was rarely used, but to my surprise, it was open. As I stepped inside, the first thing I noticed was how cold it was in there, almost as cold as it was outside. It was eerie. The door must have been open the entire game. The lights were off, and I didn't have my phone with me to use as a flashlight. I closed the back door behind me, and as I started feeling my way along the walls to find the light switch, I heard something. A locker clicked shut somewhere in the darkness. I called out, "Who's there?" assuming it was one of my teammates, but there was no reply. The darkness in the room wasn't complete. I could still make out shapes and shadows, but it was enough to make me uneasy. I began walking slowly down the aisles of lockers, scanning each one for any sign of movement. As I walked, I could hear footsteps, faint but unmistakable, coming from somewhere in the room. I wasn't alone. When I reached the last aisle, I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. At the far end of the row, a large figure was moving behind the lockers, almost as if it were trying to hide. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to get out of there as fast as I could, so I turned and headed back toward the main entrance, but when I reached it, the door was locked from the inside too. In a panic, I fumbled for the light switch, and when the fluorescent lights flickered on, I felt a small wave of relief. The return of light gave me enough confidence to confront whoever was in the locker room with me. I began circling the aisles again, but this time I was more determined. However, no matter how many laps I made, I couldn't see anyone. Yet the footsteps continued to follow me, always opposite from where I was, as if someone was mirroring my movements. I called out repeatedly, but I was met with nothing but silence. Then I noticed something I hadn't before. The lockers had tiny holes in them, small enough to be unnoticeable unless you were looking closely. An idea struck me. I could look through one of those holes and see who was on the other side. Quietly, I got down on my knees and pressed my eye to one of the holes. At first, I saw nothing but darkness, and I thought maybe I was imagining things. But then I realized with a jolt that what I was staring at wasn't darkness at all. It was an eye. Someone was looking back at me. I didn't stick around to find out who it was. I bolted for the back door, my heart pounding in my chest, and ran faster than I had ever run in any game. When I found my coach, who looked understandably annoyed, I told him there was someone in the locker room. At first, he dismissed it as probably being the janitor, but when he saw the fear in my eyes, he believed me. He signaled the refs to pause the game, explaining that there might be an intruder in the locker room. Half of my team and the coach went in to investigate, but by the time they got there, whoever it was had already gone. The back door was still open, and the room was freezing cold. We later discovered that 4 of my teammates were missing clothes from their lockers, all from the freshman aisle. I shuddered to think what kind of person was in that locker room with me that night. I'm just glad I never found out. My younger brother is a hockey player, but since he's only 13, I'm often the one who has to drive him to his games and practices. His team plays at an outdoor rink, so it usually gets really cold. A couple of weeks ago, I took him to a game, and since I tend to get bored watching, I brought my girlfriend, Michelle, along to keep me company. By the end of the first period, my brother's team was down 4-0, and Michelle and I were losing interest fast. We decided to head off to a more secluded area of the park, not for anything inappropriate, just to smoke the stuff we brought with us. Michelle isn't a big smoker, but I can usually convince her to join me. The park where the rink is located is surrounded by dense forest, which the locals call the Burning Woods for obvious reasons. We found a spot behind a cluster of big trees and had just started lighting up when we heard footsteps approaching. In a panic, I quickly put the lighter and pipe away, my mind racing. The footsteps were accompanied by a chuckle, and soon enough, two guys appeared from the shadows. They looked to be in their mid-20s, one with a painfully cliché green mohawk and the other a big bald guy with a goatee. The guy with the mohawk laughed and said, "It's cool, don't worry about it. You got enough for two more." My first instinct was to tell them to buzz off, but for some reason, what came out of my mouth was, "Yeah, I think so." I'm not proud of it, but I'm a bit of a coward. I always think of the right thing to say in my head, but I never have the guts to actually say it. After I agreed, the guy with the mohawk told me he was just kidding and that he had some super dope Durban poison or something in his car if we were interested. I looked at Michelle, who shrugged, but I could tell she was just as uncomfortable as I was. Neither of us wanted to go with them. I looked back at the hockey game in the distance and said, "No, it's okay. We were just finishing up anyway." The guy just nodded and stuck out his hand for a high-five/handshake. I awkwardly shook his hand and then directed Michelle back toward the rink. We both agreed that those guys were weird, but we tried to brush it off. We stopped a little further away, deciding it was safe to finish our smoke after all. As Michelle lit the pipe, I heard footsteps again, rustling through the leaves. I glanced quickly to the side and saw the guy with the green mohawk standing behind a tree, his head peeking out just enough for me to see him. I did that thing with my eyes where I looked over in his direction to hint at Michelle that we weren't alone. I didn't want to confront the guy because by now, I was sure something was off about these two. We both heard the snap of a stick from right behind the tree we were standing near, and that was all I needed. I grabbed Michelle's arm and started walking back toward the rink, back into the lights. We made it out of the tree line and onto the path, but as we did, we heard one of the guys call out to us. We turned around, and there they were, standing at the edge of the trees, maybe 20 feet away, with those eerie smiles on their faces. Then I saw a third guy behind them, half hidden by a tree. "No, it's okay, guys. Thanks," I yelled back, trying to sound casual, but inside I was panicking. I didn't dare turn my back on them as I nudged Michelle forward, quickening our pace toward the bleachers, which were now only about 50 feet away. I feared that if I turned around, I'd see a gun or something in their hands. We made it back safely to the bleachers, feeling a sense of relief being around other people. The game ended, and my brother's team lost 9-5. He stayed after a bit to talk with his coach, who was offering him a position on another team. By the time he was done, almost everyone had left, and there were only 3 cars left in the parking lot. As we got into my truck, I noticed a car behind us, tailgating as we pulled out of the lot. Then it started honking. My stomach dropped. I knew it was them. They must have waited for us in their car, targeting us for reasons I couldn't understand. By some stroke of luck, we didn't have to drive far. Parked on the corner of a side road, seemingly waiting to catch speeders, was a police car. We pulled up next to it, and the car behind us sped past. We quickly pointed to the car and told the officer that those guys had been harassing us. The cop nodded and said, "Okay," before rolling up his window again. I was hoping he'd chase them down, but he didn't. We drove home slowly, hoping to see the cops' lights flashing behind us, but nothing happened. Even now, weeks later, the whole situation still scares me. Every day I think about it and wonder what could have happened. All my life, I'll never forget this experience. I grew up with a close group of friends who all loved baseball. 6 of us were on the same team in a local league, and all 8 of us would play pickup games together whenever we could. We lived in a rural area, and there was this little-known clearing in the woods that had a baseball field and a basketball court. It was like our own private park. No one else ever seemed to be there because no one knew about it. We were all around 11 or 12 years old at the time, and living in the country meant our parents were a bit more lenient about letting us out unsupervised. This field was about a quarter-mile from my house, so I'd always walk there with my baseball bag, which had my bat, glove, and a few extra balls in it. That day started like any other. It was a Friday evening in mid-July, and the sky was turning that deep orange color as the sun began to set. We knew our game had to wrap up soon because it would be dark before long. I was up at bat when two of my friends out in the field pointed to something. We all turned to look and saw a group of men entering the clearing and sitting down on a nearby bench. There were 6 of them, and even now, I'd guess they were in their 20s or 30s. It didn't look like a gang, but they definitely weren't the kind of guys you'd want to run into in a dark alley. What was unsettling was how they just sat or stood there, watching us play baseball. I could see and hear them laughing, making a lot of noise. We all exchanged glances, silently agreeing that it was time to pack up. The sun was setting anyway, so it seemed like a good excuse to leave. As we were putting our stuff into our bags, the men started calling out to us, telling us not to leave. When we looked back at the bench, we saw all 6 of them standing, still watching us intently. You might think it's silly that a group of 8 kids would be scared just because some men entered the park, but you have to understand how they were staring at us. It wasn't normal. Here's where things got worse. I usually walked home alone because my house was in a different direction from everyone else's. I asked my friend Jordan to walk with me to the dirt path that led out of the clearing, just so it wouldn't be so obvious that I was on my own. We gave each other a quick high five and then went our separate ways. It was getting really dark now, especially in the woods, and that's why I always kept a flashlight in my baseball bag. Every snap and rustle in the underbrush made me jump, and I found myself constantly shining my light around in paranoia. My heart was racing. I just wanted to get home safely and crawl into my warm bed. Each step seemed louder than the last, and I was hyper aware of every sound. Then I heard laughter and screaming, not the playful sounds of my friends, but the deeper, more menacing voices of grown men. My pulse quickened, and I picked up the pace, not caring about the baseballs that fell out of my unzipped bag. I sighed in frustration, dropping my bag to hurriedly gather the balls with my flashlight. That's when I heard it, the unmistakable crunch of leaves and twigs underfoot, coming from behind me. My heart stopped. I turned and shined my light, revealing a tall man in a black hoodie, the hood pulled low over his face. He was inching closer, but the moment my light found him, he broke into a full sprint toward me. Panic set in. I dropped everything, my flashlight, my baseball gear, and ran as fast as I could. I could hear him gaining on me, his footsteps pounding in my ears. It wasn't until I saw the lights from my house that I dared to scream for my mom and dad. My pursuer must have turned back because when I reached the safety of my house, he was gone. My parents were hysterical when I told them what happened. They called all 7 of my friends' parents to make sure everyone had gotten home safely. Thankfully they had, though Jordan said he was briefly followed too. He wasn't chased after he started running, though. After that night, our parents forbade us from going back to that field. We still live in the same house, and it's unsettling to know that those men, one of them, or maybe all of them, know where I live. If you've made it this far, you're 100% a horror fanatic, and we approve. If you love our campfire-themed horror storytelling experience, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on our daily uploads.